Welcome everybody to this webinar. Today our speaker is Dr. Keith Brownwell. Dr. Keith has been passionate about this career. We were just talking a few minutes before, and he told us the story about that he started thinking on incubations since he was 10-year-old. He had his own hatchery at home, and then he decided to study it was animal science, right, Dr. Brownwood?
The first was animal, and then graduate work was all poultry.
Yeah, okay. And then he did his PhD on reproductive and on fertility.
Yep.
And so, I mean, if you talk with somebody that has been on incubation since he was 10 years, it's because he really loved his career, and all his knowledge has been promoted from that passion. So Dr. Keith Brownwell, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for preparing this presentation for us. And let's start the topic. And before we start, please remember that we have a box at the bottom where you can do all your questions and we will answer them at the end. Remember, we will have Spanish and English languages. So if you're Spanish or a Spanish speaker, just press the button at the bottom on the bottom that has like a globe or a circle, and then it will throw you the Spanish or English selection. I'm going to say this in Spanish just so that the Spanish speaker got it. And then, bienvenidos a todos. Gracias por haberse registrado con nosotros a este webinar. Hoy contamos con el doctor Keith Brownwell. Keith ha estado con la compañía por más de 7 años. Y bueno, hoy nos dará la presentación acerca de pérdida de humedad. Si ustedes quieren, en la parte de abajo tenemos la opción de interpretación en español. Entonces lo que deben hacer es oprimir el globo que está en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccionar español. Si desean hacer alguna pregunta durante el webinar, lo que pueden hacer es oprimir el botón que dice QIA, también en la parte inferior de la pantalla, y ahí pueden hacer sus preguntas y las estaremos respondiendo al final. All right, Dr. Keith,
All right.
public is yours.
Thank you. It's kind of hard being on this side. I'm used to starting off talking right away. I had to nod right away. So let me share my screen here, making sure I do it correctly.
Okay.
You all see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Thank you much. It is kind of fun to be on this side of the webinar here. I'm usually in the hosting side, but it's kind of fun to talk to y'all every now and then about different topics. And today's topic, I think, humidity and moisture loss is one that we get a lot of comments and discussion, and I'm kind of surprised sometimes that people aren't monitoring this when they should think. But let's just talk about the importance of moisture loss in our eggs during incubation, why it is important, and how we can measure that and use it for our hatchery. So what do the embryos require? We know they require heat, fresh air. They need to be cooled early on, and we have to control and monitor humidity. Interestingly enough, Carolina had said when I was young, I started incubating eggs, and I bought a big incubator, and I lived in Arizona, and I put it in a room. And this was the summer in Arizona. And that's when I realized that most incubators don't have the ability to cool, particularly smaller incubators. And I went out there one time, and in the part of the barn where it was sitting, looked at the thermometer in there, and it was 117 degrees inside there. So it's fair to say that nothing hatched. That's when I really realized, okay, there's a lot of different things that incubator needs to do. And so, I've learned a lot of things through trial and error over the years, but, going to school and learning the science behind incubation is always good. Now, knowing the science, that's where monitoring our moisture loss comes into play. is that we use that to develop the art of incubation, make the changes that we need in our incubation process to get the most out of our incubators. So what are the four pillars or the four requirements of incubation? And basically all incubation equipment does this. Temperature. The embryo constantly requires a specific temperature for its development, not 117 degrees like I had many years ago, but they do require a specific temperature for development. The beginning, they're requiring heat. At the end, they're releasing heat. So we know if we have hatches coming off too early, one of the things we can look at is how is our temperature? Is it too warm? Is it pushing them too much? If it comes off too late, we can look back at temperature and say, okay, maybe we don't have enough temperature, and we can adjust that to get the incubation process sped up a little bit. Ventilation, providing oxygen, removing CO2, removing water, and heating. And we have to do this to some extent. At certain times in some of our incubators, we don't ventilate a lot. It helps our incubation process, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But basically, we need that ventilation because we have to control the environment in those incubators. We have to remove that CO2 when it's there. We have to remove the heat when we have excess heat, and we have to give them oxygen when they're requiring oxygen. Turning eggs. All incubators need to turn eggs. It's essential in the first 7 days of incubation, turning eggs. It stimulates embryonic growth, prevents the embryos from sticking to the shell membrane. It is not necessary after 2/3 of the incubation cycle. So in chickens, we actually can stop turning at 14 days. It's not necessary to turn after that. We see no benefit from it. I say 2/3 of incubation. Of course, that would be different in pheasants. That would be different in turkeys. And some like Muscovies is a 35-day incubation period. And some of the other really big birds. But after 2/3 of incubation, they don't need to be turned. Humidity and moisture loss. That's what we're going to be talking about today. That's the other thing we have to control. By monitoring moisture loss in our chicks, it helps us to determine what our humidity levels should be in our incubators. So humidity and moisture in there. What is humidity in there, and how do we measure it? Several different ways we can look at humidity. Absolute humidity, and we'll talk about these. Relative humidity, wet bulb temperature, dry bulb temperature, and a psychrometric chart. I call it a psycho chart, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. If you request this presentation afterwards, there will be more in it in the PDF that you'll get that goes into the psychrometric chart a little bit in more detail and how to use it and how to measure what's going on in your machines. All we need is 2 points, 2 measurements that we can determine everything else. But we're not going to go too deep into that today, but that is something that we use. I've been asked before, how do we use that? Is there something more simple? And that's not simple, but if we understand it, it's actually not as bad as it looks. So absolute humidity and relative humidity, what are the difference? Absolute humidity is the actual amount of water vapor present in the air, commonly referred to as absolute humidity. It's usually expressed in moisture per cubic meter of air, grains per cubic meter of air. Absolute humidity is the totally independent of the temperature. Relative humidity is a percentage of the amount of moisture the air could possibly hold. This is what we normally use in our hatcheries, in our hallways, in our egg rooms, in our incubators, in our hatcheries, everything. We're monitoring relative humidity. It is expressed in a percentage as the ratio of vapor pressure to saturated vapor pressure, meaning it's kind of telling us the saturation point of that air, so that can change when the temperature of the air changes, and we'll go over that. But relative humidity is what we typically measure when we're looking at, because it's a little bit easier thing to measure than the absolute humidity. The temperature goes up, relative humidity goes down, and vice versa. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those. Looking at wet bulb temperature, and I'm not going to go through everything on here. Again, some of this is here, so when you request a PDF of this, you will have all this. But basically, the wet bulb is the adiabatic adiabatic saturation temperatures measured by the thermometer with a wet bulb wrapped in a muslin cloth. Evaporation of water from the thermometer bulb, cooling effect indicated by wet bulb temperature. That's why we have a lower wet bulb temperature than we do or dry bulb temperature. Dry bulb temperature is usually referred to as the air. So this would be our dry bulb temperature. As the air temperature or the ambient temperature, I typically like to call it ambient temperature. When people refer to the temperature of the air, they're usually referring to the dry bulb temperature. And that's the other thing, wet bulb, dry bulb. Those are the two main ones that we use in hatcheries, and trying to manage that, monitor that in our hallways and in our machines, in our egg storage rooms, even in our trucks. We try to do this for a number of reasons. So looking at this again, relative humidity. Relative humidity represents the amount of in air as a percentage. So if we have 0% relative humidity, we have no moisture, no water in the air. 50% relative humidity means that we're half saturated. So the air itself is holding half of the amount of water that it can hold in that air. 75% relative humidity means it's 75% essentially saturated, meaning 75% of the airspace has water or moisture contained in it. 100% relative humidity means it's saturated. It's raining. You know, we can feel that. We can definitely feel that. So 100% means that it's saturated or it's full. We can look at it a different way. Water vapor, 100% relative humidity, water vapor completely fills the air. At 50% relative humidity, we have more capacity to handle air, to hold air. Some of these are important to know as we're trying to pull moisture out of the machines. At different times, we have to have air that has capacity to hold more moisture. I was in a hatchery years ago, not a few years ago, and we had some high humidity alarms in their hatchers, and it was just going off, and I happened to be there, and we went and looked, and somebody decided to hose down the floors of the hatcher hallway while the birds had started the hatching process, meaning that them hosing down with the hot water in there, the air that machine was pulling in had a higher relative humidity than what the machine had. So we couldn't pull any moisture out of the machine. We were actually adding it. So we have to make sure that when we're looking at our room temperatures and room humidities, we're allowing right humidity. Sometimes we want enough being brought in. Sometimes we want the capacity to pull it out. So looking at that again, relative humidity at 100% relative humidity at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. If that temperature goes up to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, we now have 50% relative humidity. Same place, same air, same water, same moisture, but now because our temperature went up, we have more water holding capacity. So we actually can pull moisture out of our incubators or wherever we're looking at. And if that temperature goes up to 90 degrees, now we have 25% relative humidity. And so now we have more water holding capacity in there. Again, the amount of water in the air has not changed. The temperature's changed. And now we have a capacity to hold more water as the temperature rises. The rule of thumb is we're looking at in Fahrenheit, for every 20-degree rise in temperature, you double the water holding capacity of the air. So when we have 50 degrees, we go up to 70 degrees. Now we double the capacity of that air to hold moisture. And so now we can actually pull some moisture out. And 90 degrees, we have more water holding capacity. Now we're only 25% saturated, essentially. And so we can hold more water. And then in Celsius, a little bit different. It's not that 20 degrees, but we can follow that. It's close, but it's not exact. That holds true everywhere. So if you're outside and you have a chicken house and you're trying to pull air in your chicken house, and it's early morning, it's 75 degrees, humidity's maybe 80% humidity, Once that temperature goes up from 75 to 95, now we have 40% humidity. Unless it rains, because that temperature now can hold more moisture, more water. The air can hold more moisture and water at a higher temperature. So when we go up in temperature, we go down in humidity, and vice versa. So that's a good rule of thumb to remember, not only for our incubation processes, but also when we're looking at our houses and trying to manage our grow out facilities or breeder facilities or whatever. So good. It's hard. You know, a lot of people like to say, "Oh no, not where we live. It's always 90%, 90 degrees and 100% humidity." No, it just doesn't work that way. It rarely happens, but it can, like right after a rain or whatnot. So good rule of thumb to remember. Beginning of this psychrometric chart, and again, I'm not going to go deep into it. We're just going to explain it a little bit. And if you want a deeper explanation, I'll be glad to talk with you about it, go into more detail with it at a different time. I'm going to give you more charts and diagrams that I'm going to talk about today in the PDF. But main thing we want to look at is your dry bulb axis here and your relative humidity here. And if we know those two things, then we know what our dew point is. That's important when we're trying to store eggs and don't want condensation on the eggs. So that's the different lines that are on there. Again, we have our constant humidity. This is the absolute humidity lines that are on our axis as we see here. Relative humidity is on the curved axis. So if we know the constant or absolute humidity and our temperature, we can know what relative humidity is, right, where the intersect is. We can also determine the dew point by the intersection of these lines as well. And then again, this is our dry bulb temperature. So we have our dry bulb here. We know what our relative humidity is. So now we also know what our dew point is. We know what our absolute humidity is because we have 2 points on that chart. Okay, the psychrometric chart is, again, it's just a measure, and actually measuring moisture loss in the chickens is a whole lot easier and really gets down to the root of what we're doing, why we're trying to look at our humidity and temperature so much. Other than the fact that we want our machines to operate properly, it's difficult for them to operate properly if we've got extreme variations in our temperature or humidity of the air that's going into the machines. We have to get go stay within the guidelines because it helps our machine operate properly. And so again, if we have that chart and we have any two conditions, we can determine the other conditions here. And again, we're not going to talk about this a lot, but we can see right here, trying to simplify it, we have dry bulb temperature. We know what our relative humidity is. Now we know what our dew point is, and our wet bulb temperature would lie here. So again, it's not that complicated if we know what we're looking at. Just one thing I'm going to talk about in this presentation before we move on is how we would use this chart. So here's a simple, okay, not simple, but here's an explanation of what we want. So if a setter hall, we want a setter hall at 78 degrees Fahrenheit and 50% relative humidity. In the summer, the air coming in is 95 degrees Fahrenheit and 60% humidity. So we can see on here, we've got 95-degree temperature, 60% relative humidity, but we don't want that much humidity. We need this temperature right here at 78. So doing that, we have to cool, right? If the room, we want 78 degrees and it was 95, we need to cool. If we cool it down to 78, we're now at 100% relative humidity, according to the chart. We're at 100%, and so we have to do, what do we have to do? Okay, we have to dry out the air. We cannot remove that moisture. The moisture loss is going to be very low, and our machines themselves are going to have a difficult time running as well. In winter, when we've got cold air coming in, say we've got 32-degree air coming in, of course, that's likely to be 100% humidity. It's cold, the air is saturated, but that's not what we need. We need it at 78. So if we go to 78 degrees, we heat it up to 78 degrees, We've now heated it up, and that means our relative humidity is now 18%, as we can see here. So what do we have to do? We have to add humidity. So depending on where you're at and what you're doing, this chart will kind of tell us what we have to do to get where we want to be. And that's just one area. There's a lot of things we can do with it. So looking at humidity in our rooms again, a lot of this helps with our chick holding, our chick processing. Our egg room, we want humidity 60, 65%. We basically want to eliminate or reduce as much moisture loss as we can during egg storage. When we have a multi-stage incubator room, we want about 50, 55%, a single stage about 35 to 45% relative humidity in those rooms that the machines draw from. Our hatcher rooms about 50 to 55%, transfer chick process rooms about 50 to 55%. So most of them are in this range of 50 to 55%. Single stage is a little bit lower. Our egg rooms a little bit higher. We're trying to reduce or eliminate moisture loss from the eggs while they're in storage. Okay, humidity and temperature along with damper openings controls moisture loss. So in some of our machines, if we're not opening the damper, there's nowhere for that moisture to go. It stays in the machine. And so if it stays in the machine, our humidity, and if we're adding humidity, or particularly when we get to hatch time, the chicks start adding humidity as they're starting to hatch, we've got to have damper openings to get rid of that. It's controlling our moisture loss in our units there. In our multi-stage machines, humidity is part of the cooling, so it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different how we operate or manage our humidity in our multi-stage machines, because that's part of the cooling process. In our single-stage machines, during the first week, we typically have high humidity. It's needed to uniformly transfer heat to the eggs. We like to have our dampers closed. It's easier to manage to get a constant temperature within those incubator cabinets. During that first week, we have a lot of people that get kind of worked up or very concerned why the humidity is so high in those first stages of incubation. That's not as important as what it is at the end. So when we don't lose some of the moisture, we have high humidity early on. There's benefits to that, to keeping the dampers closed and the way our machines can operate, heat, cool, ventilate. Air exchange through the machine is constant. We don't have new air coming in all the time. We're managing that air that's in there. As the embryos start growing, then we have to start opening the dampers and controlling the dampers. We allow the chicks to build a little bit of CO2 as well, and is beneficial. So the eggshell contains pores from which water vapor is lost from the egg during incubation. So that's how our moisture is lost, is through pores. We get the question a lot. So, well, if we got really thick eggshells, like you might find in pullets, yeah, moisture loss it's a little bit different. We've got a thicker egg, but we have more surface area for the mass of the egg itself. But that's how our moisture is transferred through the pores of the eggs. How are humidity and temperature related? So this is a nice chart I like to use. So if our temperature is low and our relative humidity is low, we're going to lose some moisture, some water, but not as much. Or we're going to lose some here, more than if our humidity is high. If our temperature is high and humidity low, we're going to lose more moisture here, because now we've got a higher temperature. The air now is less saturated. It can actually handle more moisture, so we're able to pull more out here when our temperature is high and humidity low. If our temperature is low and humidity is high, we're going to lose very little moisture. Got too high of humidity, temperature's low, the water holding capacity of that air is reduced, and we've got high humidity, so there's nowhere for the water to go. So we lose the least amount of moisture. If we have high temperature and low humidity, we'll lose more moisture than this section, but this is the ideal area here. Keep our humidity at a point and our temperature at a point where we lose the most moisture when we want it. Of course, we want to control moisture loss. We can't just lose moisture. But understanding these points here helps us as we're trying to balance what they need, what we need to lose and what we need to maintain in those embryos. We've got to lose some moisture. During the incubation process, this little diagram I looked at was interesting. It was the other way around, and I had to turn it because, like most of you, eggs don't belong with the big end down at the bottom, and this is the way this was done. So I changed it. One of those things I can't hardly look at if it's oriented incorrectly. So in the incubator, we've got heat being added. Early on, the embryos are not producing heat, so we're adding heat. We're actually adding very little heat because if we keep our dampers closed and opened up, once we get that temperature right, we're not having to continually add heat. But that's the process during our incubator. If our dampers are closed, our CO2 is going to rise. Our humidity will also rise because there's nowhere for that moisture to go. It's staying in that cabinet itself. The embryo requires oxygen. It requires more oxygen later in development. Early in development, we actually don't need to pump a lot of oxygen into those eggs. We actually like a little bit of the CO2 increase early on in incubation. So a single stage, we can monitor this and manage for this. In multi-stage, we cannot because we've got all different ages of embryos. CO2 is a byproduct of growth. So when we get to the growth phase of that embryo, we're producing a lot of CO2. Early on, we're not as concerned about it. Late, we've got to get that CO2 out as we have rapid growth of that embryo. Humidity, they're losing a lot of moisture. It's a byproduct also of their growth and development. So CO2, the byproduct of growth and development, and we'll see humidity go up as well. And heat, they're producing heat. We've got to get heat out of that growing embryo. So how do we do this? So if we look at it, I'm going to use an example here. And again, this can be used in a lot of different places. It doesn't have to be just our equipment, but that's the example I'm going to show you. So we would have a profile similar to this. And this is not saying copy this profile and do exactly this, but this is an example of a profile. So we want a higher temperature early on when the endothermic, they're not producing heat. So in this stage here, we're adding heat, but it's decreasing a little bit. Our dampers are typically closed at this time, so the air that's in that machine is circulating around, and we may add a little bit of heat. We may have a little bit of cooling, but really not that much in this first week of development. But this is the air temperature, the ambient temperature we're striving to have. And you can see the humidity. We often go over this in our single stage when our dampers are closed. We often go over this. It's not a concern. It's really not. We have a target there, but if it's high here, we can actually get that moisture out of the birds back on this back end. And it doesn't, there's no detriment to the birds themselves. Again, our CO2 starts to build when our dampers are closed. And then at the point that our CO2 gets too high, 8,000 or 9,000, we start opening the dampers. We can see as soon as we start opening the dampers, CO2 drops, our humidity drops, and that's in our guide as well. That's what we're striving to do. So that's kind of an example of how we would manage this. Humidity, we need to reduce humidity levels to release water from the egg. This initiates the formation of an airspace sufficient for pulmonary respiration. So when the chick develops, we have an air cell here, and this would be an ideal air cell at, say, 18 days. The chick will pip into this air cell, and that's the first stages of respiration, that they start using pulmonary respiration rather than through their circulatory system. And so we have to have the air cell correct. If it's too small, and I'll talk about that a little bit, some of the things that can happen with that if it's too big, and I'll talk about that as well. When moisture loss before pipping is less than 6.5%, and that's just a number put there, the resulting air size is insufficient to engage pulmonary respiration. The chick may start pipping into an area that air cell should be, and it's not. And so what is in that area? Moisture, fluids. And of course, that's detrimental. If the moisture losses are more than 18%, the risk of dehydration increases. We have a large air cell, and so that means the moisture within that surrounding that chick, the amniotic fluid, albumin, and everything it started to be pulled out because there's just nowhere else to pull that humidity out. Again, our ambient temperature and our egg are trying to get some sort of a balance. So that's why it's critical to watch what our air is, our ambient air is, to manage, because if we've got so much moisture in our air, it's not going to pull it out of the egg. If we've got too little, it's going to pull too much moisture out. Just kind of the laws of thermodynamics, how they work. What do we want by 18 days? And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but our multi-stage, everybody says we want 12 to 13%. In our single stage, we want 9 to 11%. Why do we want lower in that single stage? And I'll talk about that. That was always something that puzzled me. It's like, how does that embryo know whether it was in a multi-stage or single stage? So why are we looking at different moisture losses? Because the embryos just grow as an embryo growing independent of the type of machine it's in. So I'll kind of talk about that in a minute. If the embryo is developing normally, the air cell should occupy about 1/3 of the space inside that egg, as we see here. And that's a proper moisture loss. Okay, the importance of moisture loss. The oxygen enters the egg through the shell pores at a rate that is proportional to the rate at which the water is eliminated. So if we're not eliminating water, we're not bringing in oxygen as well. When water leaving the egg is reduced, so we're not having enough water loss or moisture loss, the entrance of the oxygen is reduced, and the embryos can suffocate. We hear that sometimes. They suffocate. Basically is because we have because the moisture that's leaving, the entrance of oxygen is also reduced, and then we have a situation where the embryos may suffocate. In other words, there's no space there for them to do internal PIP and start hatching. With too much water and too little oxygen, the chicks hatch late, and they're often large and weak. When relative humidity, the surrounding air, is too low, we have metabolic water will be removed from the egg faster than the developing embryos producing water. So then we start getting moisture pulled from the yolk and the albumin, excess moisture from the yolk and albumin. And that's detrimental to the growth of the embryo. You may get to a point where they've pulled so much yolk and albumin out that the bird now is basically already drying out in that egg. Of course, when it hatches, we have dehydration, dehydrated chicks. Chicks often hatch early because they're not losing moisture. They're kind of instilled to hatch, or encouraged to hatch out, just because they're the nature of their physiology. And so they're hatching out a little bit early. They're typically a little bit smaller and a little bit weaker. And so when we see here the chicks are trying to PIP at this particular time, we need that air cell for them to PIP. If they're going into that stage right here about 19 days and they're trying to internal PIP and they can't hit that the air cell, we're going to have problems. They're not going to start pulmonary respiration. That is one of the peaks that we have in mortality of chickens, is that time when they're supposed to initiate pulmonary respiration. The air cell of the chick's pulmonary respiration stimulus determines the air cell size. We have to have a proper air cell size. We can measure that. Most of us do that. Look at, okay, where's the PIP line? What does it look like? When the chicks perform the internal pipping and later the external pipping, that directly affects the chick quality. We have to have that loss so they can hatch properly. So why, again, back to why we need different moisture loss for different multi-stage or single stage. And using this chart, and I've used it several different times for different things, but it kind of works. We see a hatch window. We can have a better hatch window. So if we have our multi-stage, let's go back to this. If we have our multi-stage, typically our multi-stage has a bigger hatch window. And so we would, if we're shooting for a lower moisture loss, maybe that 9 or 10, we're more likely to have some too much, now we're down at 6, 7% or too little moisture loss because of that hatch window. It's a big hatch window. If we narrow that hatch window, we can then give the birds more appropriately what they need. So if we've got a narrow hatch window of 24 hours, and we can look for a 9 to 10% moisture loss, because there's not a concern of those that are out here that might get too little, that 6 or 7%. and the other way around. So it's basically the reason why we have a difference between multi-stage and single stage is the single stage we're able to get a tighter hatch window, more like Mother Nature. It's a 24-hour hatch window for Mother Nature in nature. And so we can look at that, and so that's really why. You're right. The embryo doesn't know what incubator it's in, but if we have a narrow hatch window, we can give them more precisely what they want because we're not as concerned with the fringe, the outliers of that hatch window. Why are we not concerned? We get this question a lot of, well, we're just, it's humidity's too high early. We're not getting that. We're trying to get a moisture loss here at 18 days to transfer, correct? So this would be our multi-stage. Of course, we have to maintain the same humidity because multi-stage, there's a bunch of eggs in there, so that should make sense. And then our multi-stage weight loss is kind of more of a straight line because the conditions in that incubator are typically more of the same. And then we see a little bit more after transfer here. So single stage, we're looking our targets for moisture loss is much lower. We can see it stays low here. It might even be a little bit lower than that. But what happens is once we get out to where we start opening the dampers, our humidity is lower. We get a moisture loss at this point. And then by hatch, they're the same. In our multi-stage or single stage. That's what we're concerned with. We're not concerned with why they're these different. We're concerned about here. Are we getting the proper moisture loss in the chicks at hatch? So we need to make sure we remember that and are cognizant of that fact, not, oh, why are they not losing it at the right time? It doesn't matter. We need the moisture loss at the end. Moisture loss is to produce a proper air cell and get proper weight loss. And so we can also look at our chick yield. When the chick's hatching, we have internal and external pipping. We have air sac initiation or pulmonary respiration initiation as it pips into the air sac. Chick quality, moisture loss is going to affect navels. What happens if we've got very low moisture loss? We're likely to see a lot of open navels. What do open navels do for us? If they're not closed and healed up, they're open to any bacterial challenges that may be in your hatchery, in your hatch basket, with all the chicks hatching in there, and even once they get out in the field. So we want optimum chick yield. We want about 67% chick yield in that range, 66, 67, sometimes 68. I've gotten data from people and they says, yeah, what's going on here? And they had 72, 73% chick yields. They might think that's good, but what that tells me is you got a lot of green chicks. You got a lot of green chicks that are not going to perform well. And so that's often a relation to when you pull or your moisture and the moisture loss you're managing in your machines. So during the endothermic phase, the first week of incubation, we want to build humidity naturally. In our single stage, we often don't add any humidity. Most of the time we don't have to. Higher humidity to distribute heat helps distribute heat more evenly within that incubator cabinet. You have more uniform development of the embryos. As an alternate to permanent use of humidifiers, some people have to use humidifiers in certain areas. Increasing humidity, closing dampers forces passive evaporation from the eggs themselves. So we have to do that sometimes. Most of the time we allow humidity to build naturally, and we do control it. In that neutral phase, that second week in chickens, we need to start decreasing humidity so the proper moisture loss is achieved at transfer and with the final chick. In single stage, that's when we start opening dampers. The exothermic stage, we need to continue decreasing humidity so the proper moisture loss is achieved. So if we don't know what moisture loss we're getting from our eggs, it's really hard to go back and say, okay, what does our humidity need to be to get proper moisture loss? Because we don't even know what it is. We might read it on the incubator, might tell us what it is, but by looking at the chicks and evaluating moisture loss of our birds, it helps us with get that art of incubation. It helps us to fine tune our incubation process. We need to make sure we're gathering that. In multi-stage, it's largely humidity moisture loss, largely controlled by the damper. Humidity is also a part of cooling, so we have to add moisture or water in those machines through the spray nozzles. So we have a higher humidity that's there, and we have to open the dampers to help manage that and balance that. And that's in our multi-stage. In our single stage machines, we want a lower humidity, 9.5 to 10%, maybe up to 11, but even 9 to 10 is what I like to see. In the single stage machines during that first week, we have very high humidity. It helps, again, it helps to transfer heat to the eggs if we have a higher humidity. It helps give us a uniform environment for the eggs as they're trying to hatch. And I've heard this from mainly spending many years at university working with a lot of small flock producers, and I hope some are here today, and I think they are. I've heard the term, we do dry incubation. You cannot do dry incubation. Dry incubation means that your ambient temperature and humidity is high enough, you just don't have to add it, but you still have to have the proper humidity to get the eggs and the embryos growing correctly, so it won't get too much loss or not enough. So the term dry incubation is kind of it's false, and it's kind of scary because I grew up in Arizona, and I guarantee you I could never hatch eggs without adding moisture. Now, parts where I live now in Arkansas, I know people with small incubators, they can get by without adding any moisture because the ambient humidity is sufficient. So we need to reduce humidity, release water from the egg to allow for the formation of the air cell. When the moisture loss before internal pipping is less than 6.5%, the air cell size is insufficient for the chick to pip into that air cell. And again, that's where they start respiration. If they're trying to pip into that and that's not there, and there's a lot of moisture there and fluids there, that's where you get drowning of the chicks, we call it. Are they really drowning? I'm not sure, but that's the term we use. When moisture losses are more like 14% or close to 17, 18%, risk of dehydration is high. What happens if we get dehydrated chicks? We have poor chick quality. They're slow. They're often very small, less active when you get them out to the field. And so they're starting from not the starting gate, they're starting behind the starting line. So if we're looking at eggs, and so we've got 3 setters, and we're looking at our moisture loss, and this is our ideal moisture loss. And this incubator, okay, we're in that range. All right, we're good. Setter number 2, okay, we're a little bit high down here. Not bad. We might investigate it, look at it, see what's going on. This one here, we need to increase it. There's just too much moisture loss in this. We're 14 to 16%. That's where we look at that machine. What is going on? Are they calibrated right? Do we have right thermometers in there? Do we need new ones, or do we need to calibrate them? We need to start looking at what's happened in that machine, if it's ventilating properly, and things like that. But that's where we look at and says, okay, that machine we definitely need to look at. So a lot of people I know look at the moisture loss in the chicks, and they look by machine or by hallway or by flock, because it'll tell them, what's going on there. It'll tell them in that particular flock, maybe we always have a problem losing the proper moisture, or another flock, maybe we always have the problem not losing enough. So if we have a chart, we have a range, it'll help us decide if we want to investigate. Are these chicks going to be noticeably horrible? They're probably going to be poorer quality, but if we're seeing this and we can correct that and get that ideal where it needs to be, we are going to have a better chick. Probably noticeable even at the hatchery, but performance-wise, we'll definitely notice problems. So how do we do this? Kind of wrapping up here. How do we do our moisture loss? We fill a setter tray with fresh eggs, including any cracked or poor shell quality, excluding any cracked or poor shell quality eggs. We want a normal egg pack. Weigh a full setter tray, record the weight and the number of eggs on the tray. So make sure we've got a proper weight, and we want to use the same eggs from what we measured at the beginning. We then label the tray to be identified at transfer. So okay, this one here, we need to do moisture loss on those particular ones. Typically, we'll move those, and so we have a tray here. We might have one down here, like as we can see, it might be a lower one, to get different positions in that incubator. And keep those separate. A lot of times we do these top, middle, bottom to get a uniform distribution of what's going on. I like to do top, middle, bottom to know if there's a big difference in the temperature or moisture loss or whatever in the top or the bottom. It helps us with our machines. Are we ventilating properly some of these machines if we're not getting that, if we're not getting a uniform moisture loss or a uniform temperature? If the eggs are tested for fertility before the transfer, do not remove any clear and non-viable eggs. This can really change the results. We just leave them in there, and that's debate. I mean, I've heard a lot of debates on that. No, we remove them all the time. We remove them all the time. I mean, typically we do not like to remove the clear or non-viable eggs. We want to just get a moisture loss of all the eggs set in there. And again, we're looking at, you know, how the development of those embryos are affected by moisture. At 18-day transfer, reweigh the tray of eggs and record the weight. Reject any trays if they are cracked or eggs on the tray, because that will greatly affect our moisture loss. If you have any farm cracks or whatever, we're going to lose a lot of moisture. The other thing is, I know, I come from a scientific background. I know if you weigh a tray, a flat, say this is what all of them are, I guarantee you they're not all that. I recommend to reweigh that tray and subtract it, not just say we weighed some trays and this is the average. It's not an enormous difference, but it is a difference. Each one has a slight difference in there, believe it or not. And weigh the empty tray, center tray, and record the weight. Again, I like to empty that center tray, not just a center tray, and take that weight out. If you're doing a different transfer, say you're doing a 19-day transfer, and you want to know, okay, so what would it have been at 18? You take the moisture loss, divide by 19 times the days we want. So now we're going to get 11% at 18 days is what we had, even though we did a 19-day transfer. So we can do some adjustments to get where we want to be. So in conclusion, analyze the collected information. Make whole team part of the test. The best indicator of a good job is those that gather data, make adjustments, not just getting data, make adjustments. If you're constantly having 15% moisture loss, do something about it. It's not that difficult to go start changing your humidity. We can modify dampers, we can modify whole entire profiles, and it's not real difficult to do that, to correct humidity and moisture loss in our eggs if we're not getting what we want to get. It's really not that difficult. The hardest part is gathering that data, which is not that hard. Corrections is an easy correction to do. So if we've got eggs that are too dry, you know, we've got large air, they're going to show large air cells, poor hatchability with weak chicks. Residual yolk is dry and thickened, so there's not much left there. They're small, weak, pale. High chick mortality in the first days of life once they're put on the farm. Reduced hatchability from the pipped eggs. Down, stuck to the shell, they can't turn. You know, the embryo is supposed to pip and then start rotating and turning in that egg. And if they're dry and they stick to the membrane, they can no longer turn. And then we get chicks or embryos that are stuck. If it's too moist, we see here, we get poor hatchability, weak chicks, and sticky beaks. Non-pipped eggs show many full-grown wet chicks with a lot of moisture. That's where our residue breakout comes in. Our moisture loss, checking our moisture loss is also important, but our residue breakouts can tell us some of that. And I'm a big proponent of doing residue breakouts. I remember as a kid, I just had this goofy fascination with, oh, something didn't hatch. I'm going to break that egg open and look at that embryo and see what it was. I didn't fully understand what I was doing at the time, but I was interested enough that I did it. And I'm still a big proponent of residue breakouts. If we've got too moist chicks, we'll have small chicks with a large distended belly. That yolk is not dried up. many cases we get poorly sealed navels, open navels, and talked about those conditions. I've been to a hatchery where they were getting a lot of mortality about 2 or 3 days at the farm and not much in the hatchery, but most of the chicks were green with open navels. And I told them, I says, you know, they're open, they're crawling around in that hatch basket and all the debris of all the other eggs there. Yeah, something's getting in those, and it might take 48 hours or more to really that bacteria to start to grow. We need those navels sealed up properly. They're too moist. I have sticky down chicks, egg content on the down, and red hawks. Red hawks is one of those things I remember years ago said, what causes red hawks? Basically, it's a struggle to hatch. It can be moisture, it can be temperature, it can be egg shape, size, whatever. It means that the chick had a struggle to hatch, and that caused the red hawks. There's not something that makes the hawks red. There's situations that make them have a difficult time hatching, and then you get the hawks rubbing on the egg as they're trying to hatch to get red hawks. So with that, I will finish up and entertain some questions if we have any.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Brownwell.
Okay.
Oh, do you hear me?
Yep.
Right. So we have a couple of questions here. The first question that came up is does high temperature can increase the water loss during incubation?
Can it? Yeah, yes, it can, because we're looking at what we talked about. If your temperature goes up and it's too high, it has more water holding capacity. And so as you got an egg and you got your ambient temperature, if it's high, your humidity is going down, and then it has a situation that's going to try and pull more moisture out of the egg. So yes, you will change your moisture loss, increase your moisture loss.
Okay, and then we have another one. And this customer said, "Hi, Kit. How do your single stage incubators manage to control high humidity levels higher than set point during the mid and late incubation when damper is being controlled by CO2 levels?"
Well, if we're trying to get more moisture loss out and we're managing on CO2 levels and the moisture loss is a problem, we really need more, we can change that profile. So we're forcing that. We can manually go in and change the damper settings and force them to be open more. Because if we're not in our single stage, we're not going to lose that much moisture early on, and we really do have to lose it later. And I've been in hatcheries before where we just started changing that profile to start forcing that damper open more and more. We have to get that moisture out. We don't want to mess with it early because it affects our incubation. We get a lot of benefits from having that closed system for the first 7, 8, 9 days.
Right. So what we can do is decrease a little bit the CO2 levels, right?
Yeah, well, we could, but we could do that to force the damper open, or we can go do a manual change of the damper setting. But yeah, we can change the CO2 levels to try and force it to open more.
Okay.
Whether we choose it depends on how we choose to monitor our machines or to manage our machines with CO2 or humidity.
Here we have a question that you have already covered. However, well, maybe let's talk about it. And it is, what happens if moisture loss is between 8 and 8.5 in layers in brown pullets?
I'm not overly concerned with that. I would start watching and see why, because we're close to that 9. I would start looking at, okay, how are the birds performing? What do they look like? You know, what's their incubation time? Is it different? Are we pushing them out too quick as well? It becomes a concern because we're down below that 9. So it's something we start looking at. I personally want, if it happens once or twice, it's fine. But if it's consistent, I would start looking, okay, what do we need to do to our profiles or our hallway temperatures and humidities or our incubator temperature and humidity? So.
Okay, thank you. Another one is high moisture loss, about 15%, create dehydrated chicks, or does it become more difficult for chicks to get into the position to peep due to the enlarged air cell?
It can. If the air cell gets too big, then the chick is more cramped in there. But also, if we get too much moisture loss, the other concern is the chicks will start sticking to that membrane. They can't turn, you know. So that we can have both. We can have a situation where they're actually sticking the membrane turning, but if our air cell is too big, correct, it would be difficult for them to get in that position. We're just taking away space in that egg form.
And this is maybe like a kind of a sample question when doing the measurement. And this guy asks if it is better to weight the entire rack or the individual trays to track moisture loss.
You can do the entire rack, because I know that's some people do that. You know, they weigh the rack of eggs and then they'll process everything off of it, put all the flats back on, and then weigh it again. That's okay to do. What you lose in that is the ability to say, okay, what's happening in different positions in our machine. That's what I like to see. I like to see is, do we have significantly different moisture loss in the very bottom as opposed to the top, whether it be multi-stage or single stage. So you just lose a process of evaluation, but you can do it that way as long as you're weighing that tray or that trolley with those flats on it, and then doing it again once all those eggs have been taken off. So you can do it. I prefer doing the other way, but
yeah, it will be like a larger sample. However,
yeah,
you won't see the difference between high, mid,
machine or something. Yeah.
and bottom. Yeah. There is a question about they have like a hatchery in a cold weather, but they don't have ventilation on that incubator. So would you expect to have red hogs and navel problems if the humidity is not adjusted properly?
Yeah. Yeah, you would. If it's colder, the air's colder, your humidity is going to be higher in that air, so you're definitely going to have less moisture loss from the birds. Again, you've got egg, you got ambient air, and that ambient air is cold, and because it's cold, it's mostly saturated with air, so you're not going to be pulling air out, and so you're going to have higher moisture loss. You're going to have open navels, struggle to get out. Definitely, you could have red hawks as they're trying to get out.
Okay, we have an interesting question here. What is the how important is the turn angle in terms of moisture loss?
In terms of moisture loss, I don't think that it has a big effect on that, other than the fact that you're turning, whether you're turning, 45 degrees. Every time you turn in a machine, it changes your airflow. If you've got a big machine, it changes your airflow enough to where it helps it be more uniform. And we can actually see that when we're monitoring. We can see little changes in temperature, humidity, and it's like, oh, that's when it turned. That's when it turned. And so individually, I don't know that it affects it that much. Like we say, oh, if it's to the left, you got more moisture loss than to the right. But that turning process helps it be more uniform. But I haven't seen where it's like, yes, if it's more to the left, we got X moisture loss compared to the other. I haven't really seen that. But turning is important. We've always said 45 degrees. Actually, it's between about 38 and 45. Most of our machines say 45, but it can be a little bit less and without a detriment, stay in that low 40s.
Yeah, and also can help on uniformity, right? Like
Yep.
because turning helps on.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it helps on a uniform environment. We have in high humidity setter room due to the outside conditions. To decrease the setter humidity, I assume, can you overventilate the machine? Now I'm thinking that maybe overventilating, they refer to increasing fan speeds.
I mean, just the process of we kind of eliminate the other. the process of ventilation, yes, you can overventilate. So if you look at eggs sitting throughout our machines, and we have we have a certain air movement we want through those eggs. If it goes too slow, then the air that's moving through the incubator is by those eggs too long, and so it isn't able to pull that moisture out because it becomes similar too quickly. If it's going too fast, we overventilate. If the air's going too fast across those eggs, it doesn't have time to remove heat or moisture. It's flying over. And then typically that creates pockets in that machine, so we have poor uniformity because the air is trying to get through that machine, and so it's going as fast as it can through the path of least resistance, and then we typically have poor uniformity. So yeah, don't overventilate or underventilate. I used to do that when I was young. I was like, oh, as long as I can keep the temperature right, I'm going to open all the openings as long as the temperature's good. I didn't know, but I did that, and in hindsight, look back, I was like, yeah, I probably cost myself some quality birds.
Okay. Does the recommendations all about moisture loss can be applied to different poultry species, such like ducks and turkeys?
Yes, it's very similar. That percent we want is the same with turkeys or ducks, whatever we want in that, depending on what kind of machines you have. 11 to 12 multi-stage, we can go down to as much as 9 to 10 if you have a narrow hatch window. But yes, it'd be similar for the other species. Now, I don't know about ostriches and emu and things like that, but I've incubated them before, but I haven't paid attention to that.
But it should be similar percentage.
Most likely it'll be similar because it is in chickens, pheasant, quail, turkeys, ducks.
Okay, here we have another question. It's about pressures and ventilation. So, those high pressures in the room and in the plant contribute to a better moisture loss?
High as in too high?
Yeah.
Okay. If it's too high, it's detrimental. If your pressure is too high in your room, it's actually pushing air into that machine. If it's too high in the plenum, it's sucking it out. So now you've got a situation where you're overventilating, essentially. You've got too much air, trying to get in and too much air trying to be sucked out. So that's why it's important to balance that. So we have ranges in plenums, what we want our pressures to be, and we have recommendations of what we want it to be in our setter rooms, depending on single stage, multi-stage, whatever. But it can definitely be detrimental. It's again goes back to the overventilating. Air moving too quickly. You're not gonna get the moisture loss you should.
Yeah, totally agree. Sometimes people think that if they suck more air out on the plenum, they will get better moisture loss, and it depends on how much.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have can the high humidity environment lead to some pathologies or diseases on the poultry, or increase the contamination on the chicks or on the chick on the young?
I'm not going to say that it would be the root cause of increased contamination, but your high humidity is going to result in more open navels. Open navels, just now you just got an open, you're inviting bacteria in an open navel. And I like I said, I saw that in a hatchery where they did have high contamination and they had a lot of open navels. And it's like they had a big problem out in the field. So does humidity make more bacteria in there? No, but that open navel creates an avenue that if you've got any bacteria or pathogens in your hatchery, there's an easier chance to get into the bird.
Okay, we have another here, and it's I think we have already covered, but if you are seeing high black bottom navels, what adjustments would you recommend for a multi-stage incubator?
The buttons?
Yeah, black buttons.
Black buttons. Typically, if you got black buttons, that's a sign of higher temperature. I would probably lower in a multi-stage. I'd lower your temperature. Anytime you lower your temperature, you're going to have to pay attention to your pull time. And again, in a multi-stage, it's a challenge because you lower the temperature now and you've got eggs at 2, 5, 7, 11 days, you know, all different ages in there. So it takes a while to really see the differences in there. But if you've got a lot of black buttons, typically it's a heat overheating. But what I would always do, that's where it comes in of looking at your like residue, hatch residue, and looking at, because I've seen in multi-stage before, and I've seen significant differences from like the middle, the top, and the bottom. So it's not necessarily the whole machine. I mean, first thing I would say I'd lower the temperature, but I would look at your ventilation too, because it may be that you're getting some black navels, but you might also be actually getting some open navels in the same hatch. And it just depends on your ventilation. So I'd look both ways. But initially, I'd say, yeah, we need to lower the temperature, but we also need to look at our ventilation patterns.
Okay. Is there any difference in moisture loss and ideal moisture loss between small eggs that comes from young flocks and large eggs that comes from old flocks?
Typically, yes, because your young flocks, typically the eggs are a little bit thicker, but more dense. So your movement through that shell is decreased. We've got an older flock, and typically our eggs are thinner, you know, easier for moisture and heat or whatever to pass through that barrier. So yeah, we do have a little bit difference there. Now, the other thing we have to remember is there's a difference in surface area per mass of the eggs, and I'm not going to get into that, but that is a difference too. So you've got a bigger egg with thinner shell, but you've got more contents in that egg and less surface area for that. So there could be a balance there, but typically, yes, you're going to get the ones with the better shells. Now, I would never tell them, oh, we need to reduce our shell quality. No, 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 we don't need to do that.
Yeah.
But yes, there could be a difference.
Okay. And if you had to choose between wet bulb or dry bulb humidity calibration, which would you prefer and why?
To calibrate,
Yeah.
depends on the type of machine you have. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I mean, you know, we're investigating and looking at different equipment to check and do calibration. I mean, your steadfast way of doing the calibration is, you know, taking a mercury thermometer in a known water temperature and, you know, and then using that even for your wet bulb. But there's a lot of different ways to do that. I don't know whether you have anything that's you found that's better than others, but it goes back to the ease of measurement too, because there's some that might be better, but it's difficult to do.
Right. And it's a term of unit. You can convert relative humidity to dry bulb if
Yeah.
you have the temperature and all the parameters.
Yeah.
But the easiest way, as you already answered, is depending on how the machine does the reading. So that will be the best way, so you can compare it in the same units.
Yeah.
That'll be great. The important thing is to do it right.
Yeah, and to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, we have one hatchery where we've been messing with, and they said they haven't calibrated anything in 8 or 9 months. And
Oh,
I mean, that's just do it.
right.
Do
And the
something about
other
it.
another key point is to calibrate your calibrator, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you've got a calibrator that's 5 years old and never been checked and recalibrated, we don't know how it is, and it's probably off.
Yeah.
I know our consultants will send theirs in yearly to get recalibrated, because if they're going to go into hatcheries, some of your hatcheries or whatever, and doing some measurements, we need to know that our calibration equipment is correct. So
Yeah, that's a key point. Also, keeping the damper closed when you're talking about single stage, it's very important. I've seen some people that they do calibration at day 10, 11, 12, once the damper is already open, and it won't be accurate.
yeah.
So yeah, the procedure is also very, very important in terms of calibration. So here is a customer, they have flocks that they have, their breeders are 34 weeks old, but they are getting moisture loss readings around 13 and 14 at transference. These are multi-stage machines. And then how can they achieve the 12 or 12.5?
In the multi-stage,
Yes, in
because
multi-stage.
because we're using that for cooling, I think your biggest thing there is your dampers openings. You need to check those, make sure they're opening properly, because we are adding moisture to cool. You know, the other thing is to look and make sure the spray nozzles are working correctly, they're angled correctly, they're, giving us the right spray in there that can be utilized in that machine. But yeah, that's your typical way to do that, because it's a multi-stage. You got all the eggs in there. Is start looking at your damper openings. Can't control humidity a lot, but we can a little bit. But I'd check, make sure it's all working correctly.
Yeah, curtains, pressures,
Yep.
and yeah, like the uniformity of the machine by itself. Is chick yield controlled by the hatching process or incubation process or both?
Both. I mean, your chick yield, if I've said chick yield of 72, 73%, I know that they're not getting the moisture loss. I mean, they're not getting it. That's too big. And some people think, oh, we want a bigger chick. Now, we don't necessarily always want a bigger chick with a big old fat belly and a lot of yolk in there, probably an open navel in there. So it's controlled by both. Mostly the incubators, but the hatchers as well.
Yeah. Well, here's an interesting question. So, and this happens
Is that
sometimes
what
in
you're doing? Just looking for the interesting ones?
yeah. Yeah, some of them we have already covered.
Yeah.
So I'm just going down and then some others are like, well, here they have, if we have an egg that weighs 75 grams, another that weighs 55 grams in the same machine, both having same, should both of them have the same water loss or different?
I would suspect different. I don't know that I've actually measured it. I would suspect it would be a little bit different. I would
Yeah,
actually
maybe in
worry about the
terms of
big egg being
grams.
broken too, but I would suspect it's different.
Yeah, in terms of grams, it should be different because the
Yeah.
percentage will be
The
the
percentage, yeah, the percentage, yeah.
the
Chick's
same.
definitely going to be different size, but
Yeah,
I don't
so
know. Do that and report back to us and tell us what it is.
yeah, and well, like the uniformity of the breeders, they get like, let's say, worse when they get old. So
Yeah.
sometimes when you have that difference,
Yeah.
you always see to the average, right?
We'd basically have to go to the average.
To deal with the average.
Yeah.
Um, mm,
Any questions that we don't get on here, we can entertain later.
yeah,
We'll have them, and Carolina or myself can get with those and try to answer them later in
yeah,
an email. If there's some that we don't, probably going to be quite a few we don't get to directly, because there's a lot of questions here.
yeah. We had a lot of questions. I mean, we have 47,
Yeah.
and then so um. Well, this is like um
Yeah, we
oil.
can answer the rest of them later if there's.
Yeah, maybe we can email the people in
Yeah.
and and then we can get by one and answer
Yeah.
some of them because there are some that are also repeat.
Yeah.
So well, Dr. Keith Brown, well, thank you so much for your presentation. We always learn from you.
Thank you.
Um,
Enjoyed it.
yeah, it was really nice. It was
And you did
really
a good job hosting too, Carolina. I'll tell you that.
Oh no, you do it best.
No.
Oh, thank you so much. And everybody, we hope that you join us next time. We will have another one the next month. So
Yep.
keep safe because we were just talking that COVID it seems like it's coming back. So keep safe, take care, and good afternoon, good evening, and And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank